Yeah? So good afternoon, everyone in this audience. I know there are still people who want to come in, but thank you for the interest. My panel here is discussing in 45 minutes the future of knowledge. And as we have heard already this morning, we live probably at a historic moment in time where there has never been as many educated people before in the history of humankind. We have heard about the exponential growth of knowledge and the related technologies that come with it. We have heard enough about knowledge society, knowledge economy, knowledge being the precious resource that will decide the future. So what I would like to start out with is to ask Randy Shechtman here on our panel, how do you see this enormous potential that the future of knowledge has in terms of making it available, accessible, and what else you see as possible barriers in making full use of this enormous potential? Randy.
Thank you, Helga. I accept the notion that knowledge will increase exponentially, as we heard with technology, as Ray described so beautifully this morning. But I'm very concerned about the access to that knowledge and the misuse or misrepresentation of that knowledge. The internet is a powerful force for good, but there's also a lot of rubbish out there that people believe and embrace. There is a digital and economic divide that prevents people from having access to scientific literature, to knowledge, and even more pervasively, I fear, there is a barrier to the acceptance of knowledge that is to the detriment of the benefit to society. You only have to look at the current election that's going on in the U.S. to see the misrepresentation of science and of knowledge that has taken hold in a substantial fraction of the American population. Indeed, this is a worldwide problem. Climate change, evolution. These are based on scientific observations and facts and conclusions, and yet they are denied by people who should otherwise have access to that knowledge. I'm also very concerned, let me just make this one more point. I'm also very concerned at the high end that affects people here in this room of commercial influences that prevent access to the most important scientific literature. You are all taxpayers in one or another country, and yet we find in very powerful commercial scientific journals that you are prevented from having access to research that is held behind a firewall, that you cannot have access to even if you're prepared to receive and understand it. I feel very strongly about the open access, availability of scientific literature in particular. So even among the very intelligent, most intelligent people, there are barriers to access of knowledge.
Randy, thank you very much for making these strong points. Now, with regard to open access, we have seen there is a movement that started within the scientific community. So one can be somewhat more optimistic that this might be tackled in the right way. But the points you made earlier about people having access, what do you foresee as, possibilities of making the knowledge available and acceptable in the sense that you talked about?
Well, I'm frankly disappointed and a little pessimistic. The principles, take an example that I'm most familiar with, the principles of biological evolution have been understood by scientists for over 100 years, and yet continue to be denied by people who base their views on political or religious principles that have no foundation in science. Now, how can one deal with that level of access to knowledge and yet denial of knowledge?
Well, just as a response, we see there's a difference between the US and Europe in this regard.
But not in respect to climate change. There still is that active denial in climate change. Or in the use of genetically modified organisms.
That's true. That's true. It varies, and I think there are structural reasons why it varies. For instance, in the US, the curricula are set by the local school authorities, while in European countries, it's usually a state authority that decides on the curriculum. So these are reasons that we don't want to go into now. But in principle, I think you have laid it out very well, and we will, I think, come back to it. Let me now turn to Ray for an initial sort of statement. Ray, as an inventor and as a visionary, you have access both to the knowledge that is produced within academia, within research institutions of various kinds, but you have also access to this very large crowd of young people out there somewhere who use whatever technology is available with startups and, who think the world is theirs. So how do you see the future of knowledge evolving? Will academia remain the same? Will the walls crumble? Will the walls become much more porous as they are now? What kind of future do you foresee for these many enthusiastic young people out there who want to contribute and, turn the knowledge into something that they can even make their livelihood of?
Well, I think you answered some of the question
No,
with your question. But let me respond to the comments that we have heard. I think there's definitely valid issues, and I'm also concerned about people who deny obvious scientific propositions for which there's a tremendous amount of evidence. However, that has its roots going way back. I mean, when Darwin introduced his thesis, it was very much a minority position, and the scientific community, along with everyone else, ridiculed evolution as being preposterous. So we still see a strong influence of, shall we call, traditional ideas about how the different species arrived here, but I think the influence of science has grown. And I wouldn't say there's a have-not divide. I mean, people say, well, only the wealthy can have access to these technologies that we talk about, or that I talk about. And I say, yeah, like smartphones, where in fact you had to be wealthy 20 years ago. If someone took out a mobile phone in a movie, that was a signal that this was a member of the power elite, and they didn't take it out of their pocket because it was big and heavy, and it actually didn't work. So only the wealthy have access to these technologies at a point in time where they don't work. By the time they work well, they're extremely inexpensive. We have 2 billion smartphones. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to all of human knowledge. It's $1 trillion of computation and communication circa 1970. So because of the 50% deflation rate in information technology, we put some of that improved price performance into price, so prices come down, and put some of it into performance, so performance goes up. That's why you can buy an iPhone or an Android phone that's twice as good as the one 2 years ago for half the price. And ultimately, these technologies become very widespread. So I mentioned that I saw some of these technologies emerging in the early 80s, and I was trying to find a way to time inventions and look for technology trends, and I saw the ARPANET growing exponentially, but it was not on anybody's radar. It was 500 people in 1980, and then it was 1,000, and then it was 2,000. I did the simple math and said, whoa, this can be a World Wide Web. By the late 90s, connecting hundreds of millions of people. We won't be able to find anything without search engines, or we'll need search engines. And did some more calculations and saw the computation and communication resources needed to create a search engine would be in place. And then we heard from Guru about systems like Watson that can actually help us organize the knowledge. We do have an explosion of knowledge. Depending on how you measure it, it's doubling every year or 2 years. And an oncologist who's specialized in a fairly narrow area cannot read every article on oncology because there's tens of thousands of them. So we need systems like Watson, which are emerging, that can actually read natural language. Not as good as humans, but they make up for that lack of reading ability through scale, through reading, millions of pages. Watson read 200 million pages in order to play Jeopardy. And didn't understand it that well. It might read one page and conclude, there's a 56% chance that Barack Obama is president of the United States. You might read that page, and if you didn't happen to know that ahead of time, conclude there's a 98% chance. So you did a better job than Watson at reading that page. So why is it that Watson defeated the best two human players combined? Well, it made up for its weak reading by reading more pages. It read 200 million pages. I get stuck at 100 million pages. So. or more like 100 pages.
In which way will this transform also the relationship between...
Well, it's the merger of human and machine. These machines are helping us to deal with this explosion of knowledge and find the right knowledge that's relevant to situations. So there are assistants, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated so we can focus on the broader picture, look at issues of common sense and reasoning that computers can't manage yet. But they're helping us to organize this tremendous explosion of knowledge. But I would not say that people don't have access to it. It's just too much for us to absorb, so we need these computerized assistants to help us understand the knowledge.
Okay. I now turn to Joel. My question to you is, we somehow take it for granted that we know how knowledge is being produced because we have grown up with it, we see what is happening now, we are immersed in that, and yet when we go back in the history of knowledge production and in the history of science, we see this is not to be taken for granted, but rather there were specific conditions, and in particular in Europe, and this is a debate that has been going on among historians for a long time, why did modern science arise in Europe and not in China, although the Chinese were well developed in some areas, etc., etc. Now, it's one of these questions that you cannot answer definitely, but you can circumscribe, what are some of the conditions that were necessary, which leads us then to the question, what is necessary today? But first, let's have a quick look back to history. Quick. And since I know how hard it is...
It is hard. But
Joel has just written a book on this, but I asked him not to...
Actually, 3 books, but I'm going to give you one. But let me make a very brief point which I think will resonate with this audience. And that is, we've been talking a great deal about artificial intelligence this morning. I want to introduce a slightly different but very closely related concept called artificial revelation. This is a term introduced by the late Nate Rosenberg, who passed away a few months ago. And what artificial revelation basically tells you is that in order to understand nature, we are very limited if we rely on our senses alone, right? So our vision and our hearing and our computational abilities are all limited by human evolution, and there's just so much we can do. But what we can do is we can reveal things to us artificially by creating tools that allow us to see those things that nature didn't mean us to see. And so we build telescopes, we build microscopes to see things that we normally wouldn't be able to see. We create vacuum pumps, and now we have to create computers that allow us to do computations that nature didn't mean us to make because our brains are limited, but we can fool nature by doing things that nature didn't want us to do. The great breakthroughs that we associate with the work of people like Galileo and Newton in the 17th century were in fact made possible by these inventions and by others like the barometer and the thermometer and the vacuum pump and a whole sort of set of tools that were made possible that made for this breakthrough. And every time you see a big breakthrough in science, the first question you should ask is, what were the instrument and the tools behind it? Now you ask yourself, where are we today? And what do we have? We have available microscopes and telescopes and computing machines that would make anything that Louis Pasteur had, look like child's play. And so we have vastly increased the power of us, not just to control nature, but to ask questions and to get them answered. And that, I think, means that we're really at a crossroads, and that's why I said this morning, you ain't seen nothing yet, because, Pasteur had a wonderful microscope and Galileo a principal telescope, but compared with what Galileo had with the Hubble telescope. And you realize, how much more we can do. And so I foresee science actually taking an incredible leap forward in the next 20 years. And once science does that, the implications for human technology are, unimaginable. That said, I'm not clear that that is the good news or the bad news. Because we give people a lot more power, we give people a lot more leverage. It can be used for the good, it can be used for the bad. That depends on what we do with it. And here's one final reflection. The late Douglas North, the great economic historian who passed away, Nobel Prize winner who passed away last month, once told me, he said, Joel, something interesting. In technology, we talk about technological progress, which has some kind of implication of monotonicity, right? That we're going forward. As far as institutions are concerned, we talk about institutional change. There is no concept of progress. It may get better, it may get worse. The last 10 years, I'm afraid, in many places, things have not gotten better. That growing gap between our capability to do things and our institutions to guide us to do the right thing, that growing gap causes me to stay awake at night.
Okay. We come back to that. David, I think it is fair to say when we speak about knowledge, it always is knowledge for what? Knowledge for something. There is no abstract knowledge which just rests per se. Now you as someone who has closely seen what markets pick up, what markets don't pick up, how do you foresee the future development in terms of what Joe just said? There will be this explosion, if we believe you, this explosion, and I think in terms of potential possibilities, you're certainly right. But what kind, and the market is some kind of institution, are the markets ready for this? How will the market perform? What else is necessary in terms of regulation? What is the role of the state? Big question to you, David.
Those are big questions. I think the thing to bear in mind, knowledge is a static. It's a body of techniques and expertise. But knowledge has to be applied. Simply disseminating knowledge doesn't actually get you very far. If it was just about dissemination, public libraries would have made the developed world infinitely educated a long time ago. Knowledge needs to be taught, and then it needs to be applied to specific problems. And that's where markets become central. Innovation is fundamentally an economic activity, largely driven by profit. And a lot of the technologies we see are a function of the profit motive. They don't just fall out of the sky. Going back to the discussion at the prior panel, there's a reason we have drugs for erectile dysfunction, Viagra, and don't have anti-malarial drugs. And it's not because erectile dysfunction was an easier problem. It's because the people who have erectile dysfunction are wealthy. And these are problems of the rich world. And there's a huge market, an enormous human need would be solved by developing anti-malarials, but the people who would benefit can't really pay for it. And so part of the interaction between all this knowledge and technology we have and the market is designing incentives such that the right problems are solved, right? So we spend, an enormous amount of technology goes into consumer goods that have actually very little practical value. I was at a panel recently and someone said, as trying to give an example of disruptive rate of change, he said, there is more computer processing power in your Maytag washing machine than the entire Apollo moon program. And I thought, well, that's the law of diminishing marginal returns. It's worthless applied to something where it does no good. My washing machine is not going to the moon, right? That's kind of a misapplication. Why? Well, wealthy people buy Maytag washing machines. That same set of technologies could be applied to solve real problems in the developing world. If we stop technological progress right now and just caught up the rest of the world where we are, that would create more human benefit than the series of innovations we're likely to experience over the next 30 years that are not going to be distributed evenly at all. So so let me try to make a practical point. Governments and institutions have a real role in shaping these incentives. So, for example, the Gates Foundation has set up a challenge for creating anti-malarial drugs. And because of that incentive, those drugs are now being developed. When DARPA does its grand challenges in robotics or in vehicle driving, they're trying to do these, create a market where one is missing to cause people to apply knowledge to create technologies to solve problems. So the technologies that we will see are not just a matter of what happens eureka-like in the lab. They're a function of what people perceive to be the profits and benefits, and we can shape those. That's a societal and a governmental and an institutional choice.
But this brings me back to open access. I mean, there you have a market of publishers who are out for profit. At the same time, researchers complain, and the taxpayers should also complain. Why are we funding research twice? Do you want to react to this, Randy?
Well, it's a very serious problem, one that I take on myself directly. There are very strong commercial influences. Elsevier is the largest publisher of scientific literature in the world. They have taken a very active role in opposing open access. In Europe and in the US, they oppose legislation mandating that scientists publish their work in open access journals. It's a problem. How to deal with it is a very serious one that I spend a lot of time on. The problem is that publishers like Elsevier, Nature Publishing Group, encourage the publication of sensational observations. I'll give you an example. Last year, Nature published two papers that claim that you could take adult human cells and expose them to low pH and turn them into human embryonic stem cells. This was made the Evening News, the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. It was fraud. It was manipulation. The first author was humiliated from the experience. One of the senior authors committed suicide as a result of his humiliation. This was, I argue, from perhaps a minority point of view, directly the result of the commercial influence where journals that are hidden behind firewalls try to sensationalize work and encourage people to misrepresent science. That has had, I think, a dramatic effect on the public acceptance of science. In the US, we've learned from pharmaceutical companies that much of the research that's published in journals like Nature is not reproducible. It does not lead to the development of drugs as predicted by these papers. This is influenced by the pressures that commercial publishers place on young investigators to hype up their work. This leads, I would say, to very damaging effects on the public acceptance of science. So although I am generally a Pollyanna about progress in science and intelligence, it will rise, we will solve these problems. There is a very serious problem with the public acceptance of science. Ray said earlier that Darwin had opponents when his theories were first published. Of course, all revolutionary theories engender opposition, but I haven't seen any opposition to the theory of gravity or much opposition to the theory of relativity. There is opposition to science when it touches personal and sometimes tribal points of view, and I'm very concerned about the public acceptance of science, that it's actually increased, that the disbelief in scientific achievement has increased in recent years. It used to be in the US, the progress in science was the foundation of the future. Now, people can blame scientists for all kinds of things and deny science. And it's not just in the US, it's worldwide. So I'm very concerned about this.
But this gets us back to the point that Joel made about institutions. I mean, we see worldwide that the trust of the public, the general public, in institutions of any kind goes down. Science is still relatively better than other institutions. In particular, the trust of politicians is going down dramatically. So this poses a question, do we have the right kind of institutions? What is causing this loss of legitimacy of the institutions we have? And what can science do? Are we caught in the middle somewhere there? Or, what can science do to get it right and make for public acceptance there where science should be accepted?
I'd just make a point about slightly different issue to respond to something said earlier that the world is getting worse in the last 10 years. That really it's not consistent with any parameters you might attach to that. The World Bank recently reported that poverty in Asia over the last 15 years has been cut by something like 90% because of moving from agrarian economies to information economies. We're certainly making progress in diseases. Biotechnology now has various fruits. You can now fix a broken heart, not yet from romance. That'll take more development of virtual reality, but from
it will come.
from a damaged output of the heart, you can now begin to repair that. I mean, there's many different examples of how we are making progress in health, but we're also making progress in reporting on what's wrong with the world.
Right.
So there's a battle halfway around the world. We not only hear about it, we experience it viscerally. I think that's a good thing because it leads us to pay attention to these problems, but it leads to the perception that things are getting worse because our information about what's getting worse is getting better.
No, I think in every age you have to realize a crisis is always momentous. And it happens now in the present, and it's very difficult to compare it also what people were afraid of in previous times. It changes quite dramatically. And if you say we now have more information of what happens, but we also have a feeling that there is less distance. We have the feeling we have only this planet, if you think of climate change. So something has happened in terms of not just globalization as an economic phenomenon, but also in terms of awareness that we do have.
In terms of the environment, solar energy is doubling every 2 years. It's now at a point, it's about 2%, so it's only about 6 doublings. We have 10,000 times more sunlight than we need. So, I mean, there's progress, but it's not reported as much. People are much more interested in it.
But the question is not so much, I believe we all here share there has been progress that has been made. At the same time, we also raise our ambition. We want more progress to be achieved. We want this progress to be shared more equally around the globe, to let people have access to it that don't, etc. So also something is changing in our ethos. Joel.
No, I want to make a point that almost every major breakthrough, particularly in information technology, is really a double-edged sword, and we better keep in mind that we cannot really talk about it just being good or being bad. And let me give you sort of the mother of all examples, which is the invention of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century. Now, in many ways, the printing press had a hugely positive effect in terms of access to knowledge, to increase in literacy, and so on. But we should keep in mind that the printing press also caused a major disaster in Europe, and that is the printing press was instrumental in bringing about the Reformation, and the Reformation led to about 150 years of major internecine wars in Europe, in which people both read the same book, had different interpretations, and went to kill each other over it, And to some extent, that is a little bit what's happening today. We see these sort of ideologically driven wars by people who actually have access to information, but they read the wrong things, or they read the same things and give it different interpretations. And so then you ask me, well, do you think printing press was, on balance, a good example? And I have a good counterexample to that, because we do know that there was, in the Islamic world, in which was mostly the Ottoman Empire at the time, actually there was a prohibition on printing presses. And so between 1450, when the first printing press appeared in Europe, and about 1720, that's the earliest we know, books were printed in Europe in every language, in Roman letters, in Cyrillic letters, in Hebrew letters, in Greek letters. They were not printed in Arabic or in Turkic letters because that was not allowed. And so 300 years the Islamic world lived without having access to the printing press. And so you ask yourself, well, do you think that has any implications for our own time? And I'm not going to answer that question. You all should think about this. But clearly, the alternative to not doing it was worse than the alternative to doing it. But we also should keep in mind that there was a very high price to be paid for this progress.
But you cannot blame the printing press.
I do not blame the printing press for anything. It's people. It is people. But the printing press basically played the role that that the internet or computers or play today. It's a medium. It's what we make of it.
Well, and we want to, so you're saying, you know, it's, if we leave out ideas, if we leave out meanings that people attach to what is a life that they aspire to, you know, and this is a question that I think we have to ask ourselves again and again, because in some way we are immersed in many wonderful technological imaginaries. Not just science fiction of an old kind, but something that seems so very close. And yet we very often don't have an idea what is the kind of society we would need to make this fully realizable. So I'm saying there is a asymmetry between the technological imaginaries we have and the imaginaries about a society that we would like to have and want to live in.
I think there's much more consensus than may be apparent, because, again, the media likes to focus on disagreements, and but the idea that we want democracy, liberty, ideas of freedom, it's pretty universal. I mean, it certainly can very quickly point to societies and nations that don't practice these in ways that we find ideal, but that was not the case 100 years ago. You could count the number of democracies on the fingers of one hand a century ago. I think the increase of communication with the printing press brought about a few democracies, and then television, radio, and computers have really accelerated that trend. It's now at least the norm. People aspire to that, and they claim to be democratic and have freedoms, and there's a lot of focus on where it's not true, but there is kind of a consensus, I think, on these values. I mean, there's some very notable exceptions, and we struggle with those. And I'm not saying we've reached perfection, but there is much more of a consensus on how we should conduct human affairs than there was a century ago.
David, you were shaking your head?
Well,
which is your right
I
to
agree
do.
with Ray at one level. There has been, democracy actually is good for societal satisfaction. It's good for economic growth. It's good for distribution. There are many good things that come through democracy. It's not apparent that, and democracy has become much more prevalent than it used to be.
It's not apparent, peace, too.
And it's good for peace. It's not apparent that every society, when it has a revolution, immediately chooses democracy as its form of government. But I was going to say, more broadly, there was a time in human history when there was genuine scarcity. There was not enough food, there was not enough shelter, there was, not medication, and so on. We live in a time when we have actually fantastic abundance, and it's really a question of institutions and distribution. There's no question that, that much of the world could be and should be wealthier than it is, and it's misgovernance that prevents it from being so, not a lack of technology. And similarly, even when there is abundance, it doesn't actually necessarily lead to, good outcomes. So you could take two countries that have enormous resource abundance, Norway and Saudi Arabia, right? Both have huge oil wealth, and yet those countries, despite this, just incredible access to material resources, have managed that completely differently. And in Norway, it's a very inclusive country. Almost everybody works, even though in theory they wouldn't have to. They have vacations, health benefits, and things that Americans only either dream about or apparently don't want. But it's a society that invests in its people and that people feel identified with the institutions. Then you look at Saudi Arabia, a country that also has enormous wealth, and 90% of the private sector workforce in Saudi Arabia are guest workers. Only 10% of the private sector workforce are Saudis. Most of the Saudis who work for the government in make-work jobs that don't produce a lot of societal value, and most of the educational resources are devoted to religious education rather than engineering education, which is what Saudi really needs. But those are two examples of, it's not the technology or the wealth per se or the abundance that determines the outcome. It's actually the institutions that manage that. And I don't know how we get from here. Maybe Ray is right that, that's just the natural tendency that will evolve towards democracy. But I think there are clearly forces pushing in the other direction. And so the challenge, I think, is there's no question that we have opportunities and will have opportunities that are unimaginable a century ago, but that doesn't mean they will necessarily be used well. We need to figure out the institutions that will direct them towards those outcomes that we want.
Okay.
If I can add to that, I think the one institution, and we heard this morning in one of the panels, the one institution that we must rely on more than any to extend knowledge and the influence of knowledge is the educational system around the world. Until that advances, and the best standards of education are applied in the developed and in the underdeveloped countries, then the rich knowledge that we're generating as scientists will not be heard. So that remains a challenge, a serious challenge.
Yeah. And we also see how the education of women in particular has really changed and has been one of the main elements in being able to bring about a change. I'm wondering whether the audience that has patiently listened to us now want to come up with a question or two. I think we can. There is a microphone, I've been told. Is it true? Yes. So we can take 2 or 3 questions.
But we have no tweets to...
We have old-fashioned questions, so please here. But please be short, because we have to finish on time.
Okay, a short question here. The gentleman here to the right, I forgot your name, I'm sorry about that. You talk about our knowledge extended by means of various scientific explorations. We look deeper down into the universe, and we look into smaller matters, and we hear more and more, and we can use our 5 senses by means of technical achievements. But my question is, do you think that universe, or our basic universe, manifests itself only through means of our 5 senses? Isn't it quite natural that there must be ways where a universe is showing itself, that we have new means, new senses to register, however deep we go into science?
Okay. So the question,
No,
I think, was addressed
was that your right or our right?
No,
I think it was your right.
I think I'm
for Joel.
I'm the victim.
Anyway, even if it were for me, I think Joel should answer that.
Definitely.
No, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, we keep discovering new things that we never thought existed and that we can't see. The best example is sort of the recent discoveries on dark matter, which turns out there's 6 times more dark matter than matter that we can see, except we can't see dark matter. We can only infer its existence indirectly from very clever experiments that we carry out. And I'm totally convinced that, 100 years from now, we will know things that nobody in this world today even suspects to be true. And in some sense, that's what's so exciting, isn't it? I mean, we know we have things today that 100 years ago people would never have imagined. And that's why this is all so exciting, and that's why I'm actually still get as excited about this as I ever did. Because the world is so infinitely complex, and we're so small, and we're just learning, we're just getting started. And I'm teaching in my class. I'm teaching them history of science, and it's always really good fun to sort of laugh at the beliefs of people, 200, 300 years ago, who believed that you could cure somebody who had the cold by bleeding them and putting
Mercury.
Right, and all these sort of funny things. And my students have a good laugh at that, these various. But then you tell them, the year 2200, somebody's going to look at us, at our exercise machines, and at our homeopathic medicine. And they will look at us as a bunch of prejudiced ignoramuses, And so the study of history, in some ways should make you feel very modest.
Let me just add, this is the great thing about science. Every scientist knows that the knowledge we have now is provisional knowledge. It will be superseded, extended, complemented by other knowledge, and this indeed makes you humble, but at the same time it gives you a lot of confidence that there will be others, and in particular fundamental research is the way in which humanity is able to expand its knowledge. And we need institutions and politicians to understand that apart from going to applied science, we also need to invest in this kind of fundamental science. One last question over there in the middle, please, the lady. There was a lady there, I think. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lena. Excuse me if the question is a bit naive, but you talk about the gap between science and institutions. But institutions are actually nothing but a group of people who run. So the gap is between science and human beings. So where are we going to find these responsible, socially progressive, collaborative, collective human beings to bridge the gap between science and, institutions?
Well, I think one influence is the extent to which scientific knowledge and knowledge in general is widely available. So it used to be science could only be practiced and talked about by a small elite that understood a certain private language and had access to that information. The problems that are brought up about scientific publishing, I think, are valid. But nonetheless, there's just an explosion of scientific knowledge which is out there, and we have tools to help us access it and interpret it. And lots of people are involved, and there's a concept of wisdom of crowds where, no one individual, including scientists, can actually understand the information, but you can actually have a crowd be wiser than any of its individuals, and occasionally we achieve that. There's also the wisdom of a lynch mob, which is not so good wisdom of crowds, but we do have an unprecedented access to scientific information. More and more people are able to get involved, and I think that does lead to more appreciation of new knowledge.
Just to very, very briefly, Randy was first.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Randy.
Yeah, great question, and it comes back to one thing that I said and has been said today, and that is that we must rely on the educational system to teach people who are in positions of influence about what science is all about, what scientific principles are, how science is done, what a discovery means, how it's understood by scientists. In the U.S., there was one physicist who was a member of Congress. There are now no trained scientists in the entire U.S. Congress. They're all lawyers, or mostly all lawyers.
Few doctors.
Some physicians, but not scientists, not trained scientists. And I dare say that's true around the world. So it will depend on our educational institutions and a willingness of people to accept science for what it is, which I frankly don't see now, and which concerns me deeply.
Yeah. Joel?
Yeah, so I totally agree with what Randy said, but I want to throw in one more thing. Science depends on ideology, because it's ideology that determines how well the institutions work. In the hands of a Hitler or a Stalin, science can be an awful thing. And I think Ray was saying something quite correctly, which is we are the fortunate heirs of an ideology that emerged in Europe in the Age of Enlightenment, which gave us many of the values that still sustain us today. And as long as these values remain valid for our society, institutions, even though they sometimes tremble a little bit, they will continue to be what they are. What I really worry about is the undermining of that enlightened ideology, which we see happening right under our eyes.
Yeah. I would like to slightly like to rephrase what you said. I would not call it an ideology. I would call it a value. And the value on which science is based is the value of free inquiry. And this was hard fought for, and it meant people standing on the shoulders of giants way back there were standing up against the church and the state, the absolute monarchy at the time when modern science came up in Europe. And this value of free inquiry is something very, very precious, and I think it needs to be preserved. And it needs institutions to protect it, institutions to cultivate and to nurture it. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up. The knowledge has a future, but we have to remain vigorous in defending the values on which it is based. Thank you very much.